Our speaker tonight is Tony Musso, who is no stranger to us. He's given us several presentations for us in the past. And I'm sure most of you, as I, have enjoyed his weekly Dateline columns in the Poughkeepsie Journal. These topics feature local historic venues, most of them not very well known, but each with significant ties to local history. His research for the columns resulted in several books: Hidden Treasures of the Hudson Valley, Volume 1, Volume 2, and an additional one, Statsburg, A Village Lost in Time. Topics tonight will include many of those sites which are featured in those books, but especially those that have to do with Hyde Park. And these books will also be available for purchase during the reception following his presentation. Also, having spent his entire career with the U.S. Postal System, Tony researched and authored FDR and the Post Office, A Young Boy's Fascination, A World Leader's Passion, referring, of course, to FDR's collecting stamps. Tony gave us a presentation on that 2 years ago. Tony also writes regularly for a number of national magazines. So please welcome back Anthony Musso.
Thank you very much, Sue. How many people were here last month for John Golden's talk on growing up in Hyde Park? Great. He couldn't be here tonight, so Golden and I are friends, and we have a little wager on the side. He drew 198 people, so if he asks anybody in the audience, I drew 199. It's really important to me. He's a great guy, Mr. Hyde Park. I'm Mr. Brooklyn converted to the Hudson Valley, and I love it. I personally think I was probably born here in the 19th century and reincarnated, and that's why I love the Hudson Valley as much as I do. The sites that we're going to discuss tonight actually come from the three books that Sue mentioned: Hidden Treasures of the Hudson Valley, Hidden Treasures of the Hudson Valley, Volume 2, and Statsburg, A Village Lost in Time. And that is because this is probably the only time I'm going to give this lecture. Sue had said, you know, can you give a lecture specifically on historic structures in Hyde Park, and especially ones that are still standing and still visible and you could still visit. Now, in my books, if anyone's not familiar with them, there are about 50 to 55 sites in each book, and you will never see, although they're very worthy sites to visit, you will never see this site, the Vanderbilt Mansion, which is a wonderful site in Hyde Park, and you will not see Springwood, the home of Sarah Roosevelt. No, it was not FDR's home, and she let them know it all the time. God bless Sarah. That's what the song in the 60s, Mother-in-Law, was modeled after, and Eleanor Roosevelt should have sang it. But anyway, what I try to do is I try to find sites that are not you know, these sites get visited by tens of thousands of people every year. They're mainstream tourist sites, and they're very well known. But there are so many other sites, even within Hyde Park alone, that have significant history, that those are the sites that I focus on, and that's why they're called hidden treasures. But they're not going to be hidden after tonight, because we're going to go through some. Now, the reason I put Springwood in this presentation was not just to say that it's a mainstream tourist site. You obviously all know that. But to show you how close a hidden treasure can be to a mainstream tourist site. Now, I have to assume probably everyone in this room has been to Springwood at one time or another, correct? You could basically hike it from here. But as you go up the long driveway going west towards the river, you go up that very long driveway to get into the parking lot for Springwood, right behind the Wallace Center, you'll see this building on the left-hand side of the drive. I have always been fascinated with this building. I just wanted to know what it was about, and finally, when I got around to writing Volume 2 of my Hidden Treasures book, I did a lot of research on it. This, in effect, this mansion and grounds was the Roosevelt's next door neighbor. This was an estate unto itself called Belfield, and it was right next to Springwood. This is a two-story federal-style house that was built in 1795. Now in 1895, sitting New York State Senator Thomas Newbold purchased the house. If you haven't heard that name before, Thomas Newbold was a Jefferson descendant, Thomas Jefferson. He was a member of the Livingston family, which, if you know anything about the Livingstons, they owned expansive tracts of land in Columbia County, Dutchess County, and even in Ulster County. And their homestead is up in Claremont, near Germantown. He also had Newbold had two very famous cousins. One was Pulitzer Prize winning author Edith Wharton, and the other one, for those of you that are into gardening, his cousin was Beatrix Ferrand, the first renowned woman landscape architecture in the world. And she would put gardens, like in Washington, D.C., she had a very unique style of putting gardens and rocks and matching everything together. And she put one in Philadelphia as well. And believe it or not, people traveled from all around the world, came to see her gardens. Well, when Newbold bought this estate, he started enlarging the mansion to today's 29 rooms. He added the veranda out front that you see, and in 1912, he called on his cousin Beatrix Ferrand, and he said, you know, you're putting all these famous gardens all around the country. I'd like you to put one on my estate right here at Belfield. And so the driveway, let me see if I could do that. The driveway is on the north side of the building. Do it for both sides. And the garden is positioned on the south side of the mansion, and this is what the garden looks like. Now, depending on the time of season you go in there, it's like any other garden. You're going to see different kinds of plantings and everything. My favorite time is probably June, July, and then again in September. You see a lot of different floral things cropping up. Now we're going to fast forward. 1973, Newbold's grandson Gerald inherits the entire estate and the mansion. He didn't have the financial wherewithal to keep up a 29-room mansion. And he really didn't have the money to keep up the estate the way it should have been kept up. So he had a little dilemma, and what he decided to do was, he decided to donate the entire Belfield estate to the National Park Service. Now, the National Park Service, this was an important site for them because they made their headquarters in here, and they not only see the FDR home, but they also oversee the Vanderbilt Mansion. So this put them in a great spot to oversee both locations. Now, because they were going to use this as office space, conference rooms, and things of that nature, they didn't make a budget for public tours. They were never going to bring the public in here. You can go in it because it's a federal building. But instead of seeing dining room, living room, bedrooms, you're going to see office space and meeting rooms. Now, if they didn't have a budget for the home, you know darn well they didn't have a budget for the garden. But with respect for Beatrix Ferrand, the National Park Service carefully covered all of the flower beds that she had put in. And there's quite a bit of room behind where this picture was taken from, too. And it's all landscaped, very nice. But they covered everything up. And it remained dormant for 21 years. It just was not touched. In 1994, a group of local garden enthusiasts formed what they called the Beatrix Ferrand Garden Association. And what they did was they approached the National Park Service and said, you know, this woman was very, very famous in her day, and it's a shame to see this just sitting here dormant. We would like to hold benefits, raise money for the seeds. It will not cost the National Park Service a dime, and we will revive the garden if it's okay with you. Well, the National Park Service had nothing to lose. So they now have had it since 1994 to today. You won't see anybody in there this time of year, but certainly starting around April, they'll be turning the grounds and everything. And they're usually working here about 3 days a week, usually during the morning hours before it gets really hot. But an interesting fact is when they agreed to go along with this, the National Park Service lifted all the coverings from the flower beds that first spring in 1994. And don't you know it, but some of Beatrix Foran's original plantings came up again that spring. Why is it a hidden treasure? Well, you drive by the house, tens of thousands of cars literally come into FDR's home, drive by the mansion on the north side, come around the garden, and go into the Wallace Center parking lot. However, the garden is surrounded with an 8-foot stone wall, and there's no signage. So no one knows what is behind this. Well, I call it the hidden garden. You know, it's just beautiful. And there is on both sides, the east and the west, there is an arched doorway that's never locked. So you can go in there from dawn to dusk anytime. So wait until the weather gets a little warmer and they get going and everything. And then you don't have to go to the FDR or any other programs. You could just park your car and walk right in. In fact, there's usually spots right behind the mansion if you didn't even want to walk from the Wallace Center. But it's a tremendous hidden treasure right in our midst that a lot of people just don't know about. The next site that I'm going to talk about, when I was here to talk about Hidden Treasures of the Hudson Valley, Volume 1, I took time to speak about St. James Church, the main church up on Route 9. And so I thought today would be a great opportunity, given the venue we're in right now, to talk about St. James Chapel and the reading room. The first church that went up on Route 9 was in 1811. Now in 1832, the rector of the church was Reverend Samuel Roosevelt Johnson, and he owned this property over here by himself. Well, he had this reading room right next to us, erected on that property, and if you go out that way tonight, you can see a brass plate on the wall because this was actually intended to be a children's school when it was built in 1832. Johnson retired as rector of St. James the following year, but donated the building and the property to the parish. In 1857, this beautiful chapel that we're in tonight was built. And it was built adjacent to the reading room and eventually connected with the reading room, which is nice because we have a nice crowd here that's able to see the same lecture. This is pretty odd, but because St. James Main Church on Route 9 did not have heat until 1955, during the winter months, the entire congregation came to the chapel. And when the heating system was eventually put in 1955, they moved up to the main church year-round. But for 98 years, from 1857 to 1955, this was the winter home of St. James congregation. Now, because FDR was born January 30th, 1882, wintertime, he was baptized right at that font that still sits in the chapel today. This is an incredibly important historic chapel. It really is. When the congregation moved full-time, year-round, to the main church on Route 9, this chapel was used for a time by a Lutheran congregation in the town. The building attached to the chapel was first used as an infant school, they called it, and there's a plaque right outside the door that'll show you that. And then it became a free reading room. So in effect, this was Hyde Park's first municipal library, free public library. They also held Sunday school classes here before the congregation moved up in 1955, and then they relocated it up to the main campus there. In 2011, the reading room was renovated completely. New paint job, repair the windows, sand the floors, varnish them, put in a new kitchen and a new boiler. And it was rededicated in 2011, the Reverend Gordon Kidd reading room. Now, the Reverend Gordon Kidd was the father of Gloria Golden, and the Goldens can't be here tonight, but that's the connection. John Golden was his son-in-law, and they renamed it because John Golden and his company financed the whole refurbishment of the room. So that even has an historic flavor to it. The Reverend Kidd came here in 1946 and became the rector of St. James after getting discharged from the military. He was a chaplain during World War II. And so that's the St. James part of the presentation. Now, I don't know how many of you know it, but Hyde Park wasn't the original name when this was a settlement in the early days. It was actually called Stoutenburg. There was a man named Jacobus Stoutenburg who was born in New York City in 1696, and he never lost his city accent either. He talked just like me, I'm sure. But he came up here, and he was the first person to settle in this town, in what became a settlement called Stoutenburg. He built a Dutch manor house in 1741. If you go across Main Street, across Route 9 onto West Market Street, he built a Dutch manor house there in 1741, 50 feet in from what is today Route 9. It was also known as King's Highway. It was also known as Albany Post Road. It had a number of names. In fact, West Market Street, which now goes all the way down, I'm an Italian, I can't help this. West Market Street originated as Jacobus Stoutenburg's 50-foot drive off of Route 9. And then the house was taken down, and they kept West Market Street going all the way down toward the river. While that house is long gone, on the north end of Dottie Avenue is a 1-acre parcel that is occupied by a private family cemetery, the Stoutenburg Family Cemetery, which Jacob Stoutenburg, this is, by the way, a mural. It's one of the 17 murals in the post office right across the street. And this actually shows Jacob Stoutenburg and a bunch of his workers clearing the land to build his manor house. This is the cemetery that he created. Now, this cemetery, his house was around West Market Street in the area of Park Place, if you can imagine that, but it was right in the middle of the road. And this is at the end of the avenue there. It still contains the remains of Jacob Stoutenburg, his wife, and many, many other people in the Stoutenburg Teller line. The Teller was the maiden name of the woman who married Jacob Stoutenburg. Now, there is still a Stoutenburg family home that exists in Hyde Park, and that is on the west side of Violet Avenue, Route 9G. And this belonged to Jacob Stoutenburg's son, William. It is the oldest house in Hyde Park today, and one of only 2 stone houses that still exist in the town. The other one, you might know, they used it, it's further south on Route 9. It was a Japanese restaurant for many, many years, and now Senator Sue Serino is using it as her office. That's the other, but this is the oldest of all of them. This was built in 2 parts. The southern part of the house was built in 1750, and an addition to the north side went up in 1765. Combined, the house is 48 feet long by 24 feet wide. Now, it's interesting that Jacob Stoutenburg was a definite patriot, and when the British were coming up the river, as you know, they broke the chain at Constitution Island, West Point. They came up the river, and they were headed to West Point to burn down what is now the Stockade District in the city of Kingston. Why would they want to burn that particular area? Because that was the first capital of New York State. And they wanted to make a statement. They wanted to disrupt the government. Actually, Governor George Clinton, the first governor of New York State, anticipated their attack, and they moved the government down to Hurley, New York, for a brief period until the British left, and then they moved it back up to Kingston. But because Jacobus Stoutenberg was a devout patriot, the British, as they did with other patriots' houses along the route up the river, they fired cannons from their ships at his house, which would have been on West Market Street. Now, they didn't do any damage, but when he retreated to his son's house until that was all over with, and when they got back to the property, they found cannonballs sitting along the property, around the house. And one of them is on display in this house today, in the William Stoutenberg house. There's also another element of history to this house. During the days of the Underground Railroad, the basement of this house was used by fugitive slaves heading north on the way to Canada to safety and freedom. A lot of history here. Now, where did a kid from Brooklyn learn all of this? I have to give credit where credit's due. Marguerite Spratt. I spent an afternoon with her at a house, and we had a great conversation about the history of these. Marguerite's late husband was he was a member of the Stoutenberg family through his mother's side. And as a result, they both have belonged to, and he was president for 4 decades, of the Stoutenberg Teller Family Association. And once a year, they have a reunion here at the Wallace Center, and I was very pleased to be there last year, which featured a film on Marguerite Pratt. So I want to thank you for sharing that information with me. Einstein said, you don't have to know everything, you just have to know where to go to get the information. Now, if you come back closer in this area, basically on West Market Street, where we just were a little while ago, you'll come to this familiar site. It's on the north side of West Market Street. And when Frederick Vanderbilt purchased the old 600-acre Langdon estate that we know as the Vanderbilt estate, he purchased it in 1895, and he hired renowned New York City architectural firm of McKim, Mead, and White to design his 54-room mansion. He also had them design other houses and build other houses on the estate, and one of them was this house right here that was a 7,967 square foot home for his personal assistant and the manager of the Vanderbilt fortune, whose name was Edward Wales, and that's how this became known as the Wales House. It is located north of on the north side of West Market Street, which was once the southern portion of the Vanderbilt estate. His estate ended right on West Market Street of today. It's designed in a colonial revival style. It's a 2-story building, 4-bay brick home featuring 6 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms, in case anyone is interested in putting an offer. I feel like a real estate when I do that. It had 6 bedrooms. It was completed in 1898. In 1916, the mansion and more of the grounds around the mansion was the site of a grand reception when Ruth, the daughter of Edward Wales, got married. The wedding ceremony took place up at the main church, St. James, and then they had the reception back here on the property, on the piece of property that they had. In attendance at that wedding reception were Mr. and Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Mr. and Mrs. Frederick Vanderbilt, and Mrs. Ulysses S. Grant, among many, many other dignitaries. Following the death of Edward Wales in 1922, this became home to Herbert Shears, who was the longtime caretaker of the Vanderbilt estate. And would I love to have applied for that job, to get to live in an 8,000 square foot house. When Frederick Vanderbilt died in 1938, Shears inherited the house and $250,000, and it was subsequently separated as a separate parcel from the estate so that it could be turned over, and it's privately owned today, to this day. Now, in 1728, a surveyor named Nathan Birdsall moved with his family from Danbury, Connecticut, onto a hillside just east of the village of Pauling, New York, the furthest eastern town in Dutchess County. When he did that, he became the first Quaker to settle in Dutchess County. And after that, more and more Quakers started pouring into the area, and today we know that hillside as Quaker Hill, which was once home to so many famous people and still is today. I draw a blank on the ones that are living there today, except for Sally Jesse Raphael, because I remember the red glasses. Have to have a reference point. Well, Hyde Park was no different than any other community in the area, any other town in the area. Quakers started coming into the town in huge numbers, and sitting on the east side of North Quaker Lane is this two-story wood frame structure, again built in two stages during the 18th and 19th century. Originally, the members of the Religious Society of Friends, which oversees all the Quaker activities, a number of them were going to the Nine Partners Meeting House, which is on Route 343 in Millbrook. But because more and more were coming into Hyde Park and establishing farms here, and it was kind of a long trip to get from here to Millbrook in those days, had the horse and buggy. And so they petitioned the Religious Society of Friends to open their own meeting here. Now, this building wasn't originally built when they formed the meeting. They actually met in the homes of two members of what they named the Crumb Elbow Meeting House. And the reason they called it the Crumb Elbow Meeting House is, even though this property here where they eventually built their meeting house is a distance from Crumb Elbow Creek, the houses that they originally met in backed up to the creek. And so when they came here, they just decided to keep the name, and that's why it's called that. They left the Millbrook, the Nine Partners Meeting House in 1778 and branched off to form their own thing. Now, the original side of the two parts that were put up is on your right. The right side of the building was the original meeting house. And that is the way early Quaker meeting houses looked. They only had one door for everyone to enter for worship services, and it stayed like that for many years. Even though this is connected now into looking like a more traditional Quaker meeting house with two doors, one for women and one for men, the interior has got the sliding panel that came down during business meetings because, of course, the men and the women had to be separate during those meetings. The original part of this, the one on the right, cost $2,380 to build. As membership in the meeting grew in 1810, they basically matched the original one and duplicated on the left-hand side and connected the whole thing, and that's why you have the two doors in front now, and that's a more traditional meeting house looking that way. The cemetery grounds that are all around the meeting house were originally only for members of the Quaker meeting. That changed through the years, and now anyone that chooses to be buried in there can be buried in there. It's more of a community cemetery right now. Okay, we are now going to come back to this area. I feel a little like a yo-yo here. We're going to go to this familiar site to, well, we got a little, you got to hit a button there. That pops up on my computer as well. This is the Hyde Park Railroad Station. How many people have visited the Hyde Park Railroad Station? I'm in Hyde Park. Not hard to believe, right? When I give this in Brooklyn, no one raises their hand. This Mission and Revival brick-style station was built in 1914 to replace the original one-story wooden station that sat a little closer to the river and was put up in 1851. At that time was the infancy of railroads coming into the Hudson Valley. Now, when the New York Central Railroad took over the line in 1914, they elected to add 2 additional sets of tracks to their line. And that meant they had to take down the wooden station because it would have been right in the middle of their track line. So they replaced it with this building here. Now, 2 pretty famous people, not only to Hyde Park, but to the country, used this station on a regular basis. First of all, Frederick Vanderbilt earned his fortune because he was the president of the New York Central Railroad. And he used to use this station to get back and forth to his office in Manhattan. In later years, Frederick Vanderbilt put a private landing on the back of his estate, on the back of the Vanderbilt estate, and he would just flag down the train. And the engineer and the conductors were not going to dispute stopping for the president of the company. It's called job security. The other person that used this station on a regular basis was Franklin Roosevelt when he was governor. He would go back and forth to Albany and use this station. In 1939, when the King and Queen came to this country, by the way, for the first time since we got independence, and they had the famous hot dog picnic up at Top Cottage, they left on a train from this station to continue their journey up to Canada. They were headed to Canada for a tour of Canada. From everything I've read, basically the whole town showed up to wave goodbye to the monarchs as they left town. And John talked about that last week too. The last dignitary to use this station was newly inaugurated President Harry Truman, when he came up for the funeral of FDR. Now, they came up on one train, but one car of that train contained the coffin with FDR in that. That car stopped at a private landing on the Roosevelt estate, Springwood. They removed the coffin, put it into a vehicle, and got it up top. Truman, the rest of the Roosevelt cabinet, and other dignitaries stayed on the train and disembarked at this station here. Now, as automobiles became more and more popular and the preferred choice of travel, railroads all over the country started hurting. Their passenger count was going way down, and that was no different here. Service ended at the Hyde Park train station in 1958. As the station was left abandoned, it was vacant, it was becoming weather-beaten, and it was also becoming the subject of a lot of vandalism from teenagers in the area. Now that I have gray hair, I blame everything on the teenagers. But anyway, they were vandalizing and breaking the windows and everything else. And in 1970, this was very, very close to being torn down. And it was saved in the 11th hour, believe me, the day before it was going to be torn down, by a group called the Hudson Valley Railroad Society, who still operates in that building today. They were originally a bunch of model railroading enthusiasts that worked for IBM. And so IBM had a hand in restoring the station and coming through with the finances for that. It is still used today as a museum, which features a number of various gauged model railroad layouts. And you know, it's open. I believe it's officially open May through October, although they do have events in December around Christmas time. But if you haven't been there to see the layouts, it's really worthwhile. And they have some docents in there that really know their stuff about the railroads of the Hudson Valley. Now, I wrote a third book. Well, I guess it's my 6th book. It's called Statsburg, A Village Lost in Time. I happen to love the village of Statsburg. And a lot of people don't realize that in 1932, they put the Route 9 bypass around Statsburg, around the village. Originally, before 1932, Route 9, Kings Highway, Albany Post Road, you would have turned in and gone right through the center of the village, and it was a really thriving village. It had 2 butcher shops, 2 plumbing shops. It had Hughes, which was more like a department store in those days. It had the ice tool factory going, a lot of industry going. And once that Route 9 bypass, you didn't have to come into the town anymore, it kind of shut the town down, and it's now a very quaint, I call it like a Norman Rockwell type town now. Very quaint and quiet, but it's amazing what it went through before that. There was so many, the ice harvesting industry was very big in Statsburg, and they had ice houses all along the river there. Anyway, if you're traveling north on Route 9, to get into the village of Statsburg today, you go on what was the main route, but it's now called Old Post Road. So you turn into there, you look to your immediate west on your left-hand side of the car, and you will see a grassy area that is, it's just the entrance to Norrie State Park at this point, to be frank. And we're going to take a look at that in just a couple of minutes, what was on that site originally. But once you turn off of Route 9 and you're heading north on Old Post Road, about a quarter to a half a mile up the road, on the east side of the road, is this house. And this is the John Hendricks house. It is one of the oldest structures. It was built in 1785, and it was one of the earliest stagecoach stops along the main route. Because remember what I just told you, this was the main route between New York City and Albany. Now, it's very clear that the second level was John Hendricks' private residence, and that's evidenced by the beautiful marble mantel places, the big fireplaces, and everything else. The bottom level would have been used as a stagecoach stop. They originally had a tavern in the middle of the building, and then bedrooms on both sides of the tavern to accommodate overnight guests that were going to stay there. Hendricks died in 1815, and the house and property was purchased by land speculator George Lamoury, who in 1884 sold 90 acres of this property to William Dinsmore. Now, when I was writing the book about Statsburg, I very quickly learned that William Dinsmore and Statsburg were synonymous. If you go to Statsburg today, first of all, Dinsmore's estate, Locust Grove, was one of 4 estates that existed in Statsburg. We know the Mills Mansion, but there were 3 other estates on that main route that you would pass by all 4 estates. His was called the Locust, and that remains the only privately owned estate today. Of course, the Mills Mansion is a state site now, and they give public tours, but the Locust is still privately owned. There is the Dinsmore Firehouse, which he contributed to have built. There is the Dinsmore Baseball Field, which is just south of the firehouse, and when that was put together, it was thought to be the finest baseball diamond between New York City and Albany. And in fact, in 1955, Statsburg, that little village of Statsburg, had their own semi-pro baseball team. And you could come out on Sundays, no charge, sit around the bleachers and the outside grass and watch semi-pro baseball, which is one step away from the Mets. Yes, that's my team. That's my team, I'm sorry. There goes one book sale. So anyway, Dinsmore was a big deal. And what he did was, when he bought this property, he built a large Dutch barn on the property, which featured the same clover-shaped windows that he had in all the barns on his property, and they're pretty unique looking. In fact, if you get out to the Locust today, there is one sitting across on the east side of Old Post Road, which was all part of his estate at one time, and you could see the clover-shaped windows. Very unique look to it. And then, of course, to finalize the Dinsmore legacy up there, you have the Dinsmore Golf Course, which he opened. It's the second oldest private golf course in the United States. It was a 9-hole golf course where people like the Roosevelts and all the other prominent people were invited to golf. And then they added 9 holes, and now it's a public course of 18-hole golf. Now, remember that grassy patch I told you about as you first drive into Statsburg? It's on your left-hand side, on the west side. Well, in 1933, shortly after being inaugurated as President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, as part of his New Deal, created the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was meant to bring unemployed and unskilled men, young men, to learn skills like construction and plumbing and electricity, so that when they finished their tour here at the camp, they would be able to better present themselves for jobs. Don't forget, this was right after the Great Depression. So if you didn't have any skills, you were hard-pressed to get jobs. This was one of the early, this opened 3 months after, right in Statsburg, and these camps were all over the country. They were everywhere, but this is one of the earliest ones that opened. And you could see the barracks, and they had a dining hall and a headquarters. There was a series of 10 buildings on the property that is now just a grassy patch. There's not a single remnant from this site left. But it's important to know the history of the area, if you want to look at it that way. The troops at this camp built every road and bridge, those stone bridges that go over every waterway in Norrie State Park today. And if you get a chance, it's usually quiet whenever I drive over there, but if you get a chance, pull over and look at the construction of those bridges. Those bridges are going to be there for another 200 years. They're very well done. Now, one of the more ambitious projects happened down at Norrie Point. There was originally, it's right along the Hudson River, and there was originally a single-family home there, and they took that down. I don't know if there was eminent domain in those days, but whatever. They took the house down, and the troops built what became the very elegant Norrie Point Inn. Anyone in the audience tonight been to the Norrie Point Inn for dinner? And yeah, I wish I was here to see it. This was a fine dining and dancing facility accessed by boat or by automobile, as evidenced by the dock right there where you can come in with your boat, and the parking lot behind the building is still there in place. But if you were coming by boat, you never assumed that you were going to be allowed to get into the Norrie Point Inn with a t-shirt, shorts, and sandals. This was a fine dining, and men wore Men wore jackets and ties, and women wore their finest dresses, and in some cases hats. They were famous for featuring big band music and dancing on the weekends. And from the stories I heard from people that had been there and taken part, including John Golden, you could dance out on the terrace because the band would project out there, and it was just a really, really nice place. It also had served as the site for many weddings, receptions, proms, and you would go there for special occasion. You know, if it was your anniversary, you'd take your wife to the Norrie Point Inn. That was the place to go. Now, for whatever reason, the Norrie Point Inn closed down operations in 1970, and 7 years later, Dutchess Community College leased the building to hold conservation classes there. It is now home to Hudson River Research Reserve, an environmental group, and it is open to the public every day. You can go down there, park in the parking lot, and go inside, and they have a lot of great, if you're really into the environment, they have a lot of great displays. They have some fish tanks in there that, you know, bring kids along. They love to watch the fish. And they have programs and lectures on occasion. So, you know, get in their mailing list and learn about the programs that take place down there. Now we're going to leave Statsburg, come back down. Actually, we're only going to go across the street to the Hyde Park Post Office. The Hyde Park Post Office was the fifth and last of the WPA post offices built by Roosevelt during the Works Progress Administration program. What Roosevelt felt was that the government had an obligation to get people back to work after the Great Depression. And so he created the WPA to build thousands of federal buildings all around the country. He built these 5 post offices in Dutchess County, which starting in the south was Beacon, the old Wappingers Fall, which is the only one of the 5 not a post office anymore. The community grew so big they couldn't put another letter carrier in there with a shoehorn. So they built a new facility. Today it's the Wappingers Falls Police Department. But they're mandated to keep all the murals and everything in good shape and not destroy any of it because it's a historic site. Dutchess County is the only county in the entire country to have 5 WPA post offices. Can you imagine why? It's nice to have the president as your neighbor. Now, Roosevelt got an idea, and he said, you know, I'd like to bring pride back to the communities, because everybody was down and out during the Great Depression. And so what he did is he wanted every one of the buildings designed after an old historic building in that town. Now, what he did was he reached out and had his team trying to find any kind of an image of Jacobus Stoutenberg's house, and they couldn't find one, not a single one. So what he did was they found a pen and ink sketch, and what this represents is an exact replica of John Bard's house. And when you think about John Bard, he's the reason that this is called Hyde Park today, because it's named after Edward Hyde, the governor of the colonies of New York. So that's exactly what his house looked like, and that's what he designed it after. Roosevelt being Roosevelt, he was very, very into history and accuracy, and what he did was he took the exterior fieldstone, which was in ruins, from John Bard's son's house. It had burned down, and they used the exterior stones to build this, to add another element of history to the building across the street. FDR personally laid the cornerstone on November 6, 1940. In its interior, I'm sure you've all noticed the murals that go around the top. How that came about was they were building Rhinebeck. That was the 4th post office in Dutchess County. And they hired a young and very talented artist from Rhinebeck named Olin Dowes. Olin Dowes was the son of Tracy Dowes, who at one time owned the Beekman Arms. And he is the, let's say, the spark that really got the Dutchess County Fair to move to Rhinebeck all these years. So he was a very prominent person in the community. Well, his son, Olin Dowes, was a great artist. And what he decided to do was, instead of putting, one mural here and one mural on the other wall, he did a 12-panel mural. And I don't know how many of you know this, but if you stand in front of the front door in the lobby of that post office, panel 1, 2, 3, all the way around to 12 takes you through the history of Rhinebeck, through the years, through its involvement. Well, Roosevelt was so pleased with that project that when they built this post office and they had a little more room to work with on the in the lobby space in this office, he called Olin down to do a 17-panel mural, which again tells the history of Hyde Park. As you walk around, there's a narrative for each mural that's up there. Now, my personal favorite mural, and there are many. If you ever get a chance, do a tour of the 5 post offices just to look at the murals. They're really beautiful. This is my favorite. It's panel 17 as you enter the lobby and look straight up. It's the last panel in the building. And this is Franklin Roosevelt. He's meeting with the Hyde Park School Board, and they're in Benjamin Haviland. That's Benjamin Haviland holding the porch, the rake there, I guess what he has. They're on his property, and they're doing the planning for the original Franklin D. Roosevelt High School. And this is what that building looks like today. Now, if you know anything about Roosevelt, he was very into Dutch, and he was very into fieldstone exterior. This is a magnificent building. Now, of course, they stopped. Actually, I wish John Golden was here, because John Golden was in the first graduating class from this school here. Now they built a new high school over on 9G, and this is used, I believe, for the middle school now. Thank you. Okay. But again, a beautiful building, and FDR actually spoke, and Eleanor Roosevelt spoke at a lot of the graduation ceremonies from this school throughout her lifetime. Now, in addition to talking about sites that are in the 3 books, I thought I'd throw a few sites from my Dateline column in there because, and thank you for anyone that reads it. I'm getting great numbers on the number of hits on that site. This is right around the corner. We could have probably done a walking tour if this was in the afternoon program because we could have hit about 5 sites right from here easily without running out of breath. Right around the corner, you get up to the corner and you turn right going north, and you will come and look at this house, which is right across the street. And this is the original Langdon Gatehouse. Now, let me explain to you how this came about. New York City businessman John Jacob Astor purchased what we know as the Vanderbilt estate today. He bought it in 1840 as a gift for his daughter, Dorothea Langdon, and it was the Langdon estate. In 1952, Dorothea's son, Walter, acquired the estate, and he erected this wood-frame gatehouse at its front entrance as a wedding gift for his favorite niece, Emily Kane. Emily Kane had married Augustus Jay, who was the great-grandson of a great American jurist, John Jay, and they lived in this house. So if you go up to the Vanderbilt property right at the entrance today, you'll see a stone gatehouse. This was the original gatehouse, but this one is built in a French chateau style. Each bay of the front facade has a pair of French doors, and the interior has elegant ceiling molding, oak hardware floors, and wood moldings reflected Langdon's wealth. He was very wealthy at the time. Now, Langdon died in 1894, and a year later, Frederick Vanderbilt buys the estate. Because he wanted his gatehouse, which I'm sure you're all familiar with today, he wanted it to match the color, the style, and just the whole look of his mansion. He removed the Langdon Gatehouse. They actually lifted it up and moved it just south of his estate. Because if you go walking up there tomorrow and you see the Langdon Gatehouse, you will then come across the Vanderbilt Wall and the new gatehouse that was put in place. Today, if you look at it, it's surrounded by scaffolding. They're doing a lot of renovations on it. It was a law office for many years, but it's a privately owned house today. I assume they're just restoring it. I don't know whether it's going to be a private residence or another office space, but it's actually a very beautiful house. Now, if you go to the corner and you don't go to the Langdon house, you turn south on Route 9 and look across the street, you're going to see this property. And this is the original Hyde Park firehouse. It's a 3-story, 3-bay brick building built in 1902, and it was designed by William Beardsley, who, by the way, designed the Dutchess County Courthouse in Poughkeepsie. Very prominent architect in the area. Hyde Park was established in 1821, and this town has the distinction of forming one of the earliest volunteer fire companies in New York State. In it's got to be early in there. The Eagle Engine Company, the name of the company, was founded, and then 2 decades later, another company called the Rescue Hook and Ladder Company was established. Both companies occupied this building. One on what was, if you can imagine the bottom floor, there were 2 bays, fire bays for fire apparatus. One company occupied one side, one company occupied the other bay. Upstairs, the second floor, likewise, had 2 parlors. One for the company on the first floor and the other one for the company downstairs, for the 2 different companies. And that was quite a thing, because when you joined the company and you got your key, it was only for use of members of the companies. And that was a pretty proud thing. You can go in there and, hang out with the guys in the private parlor for the company. The top floor was a meeting hall where a lot of dances and socials were held at the time. Now, let me see, where did I go? The two companies merged in 1958, and as you can imagine, by that time, from 1902 to 1958, the firefighting equipment was getting very large. They could no longer fit in those two small bays. And so in 1961, today's firehouse further south on Route 9 was built. This building went up for sale, and John Golden purchased it. So now on the first two floors, you have apartments, and on the ground floor, which is one of the major reasons I put this slide in the thing, one of the storefronts that they converted the bays, took those doors off, and made two storefronts on the bottom floor. And one of the reasons I'm putting this in the lecture is one of those storefronts today is the Hyde Park Historical Society Museum. Now, how many people have visited that? Okay, so there's a lot more that have to go. They have wonderful artifacts, documents, everything. You really should go in there when they open for the season, and it's usually open on Saturdays and Sundays. And I happen to have in the audience Patsy Costello. Just raise your hand in case they want to talk to you. She's the president of the Hyde Park Historical Society. So if you have any interest in what goes on there, and maybe you want to join the Historical Society, which would be even better, talk to Patsy right after the talk. I'm going to end with one structure that unfortunately is not open to the public anymore, but it's a very important structure in Hyde Park history, and I really would be remiss if I didn't end the talk with this. This is Cromwald. It was built between 1886 and 1889 and is a three-story mansion that was home to Colonel Archibald Rogers. Now, has anyone heard of Archibald Rogers? His grave actually is right behind St. James Church, and it sits right next to the family of John Bard, is the Archibald Rogers graves. During his youth, FDR joined the Rogers children in one room of the mansion, which was called the classroom. And that was their elementary education before FDR went off to Connecticut to more like a high school and then on to Harvard. But this was his first formal education, and the teacher happened to be Mrs. Rogers. Now, during World War II, the 306th Military Police took over the estate, and they were there basically to protect Franklin Roosevelt, president during World War II, at his home. And at that time, there were sentry stations all along Route 9, and they manned those sentry stations to kind of check out everybody going up and down Route 9 at the time. In 1947, Daniel Trotsky bought the mansion and sold off part of the estate land to help him pay for what he bought. And that property that he sold off was eventually subdivided into quarter-acre lots and were used to build private homes. In 1951, the mansion and what was left of the estate grounds was purchased by the Catholic Church, and the Emard Seminary operated here for about 20 years. It was closed and sold in the 1970s and sold again in 1983, and is now, the estate is occupied by the Millennial Kingdom Family Church. And unfortunately, I've tried to get in there many, many times, but the gate is always padlocked in the front. And the people that do live in there, I understand there's about 500 people living in probably those houses that were originally sold off, but you have to be a member of this church to get in the property now. So it's unfortunate because this is a really, really important part of Hyde Park history. And that's the formal lecture. I'd love to take some questions if you have any. Excuse me? What was that question?
How much did Golden pay for the firehouse?
I was sworn not to tell. Here you go. Got a microphone here. I had a hand right here somewhere.
He told us last week it's $19,000.
And he told me I was special, and I was the only one that knew that.
Okay. Anyone else?
Any other questions in the room here? Here's a question. What's that? Norrie Point Inn? The Norrie Point Inn? The building is still up. It had a fire, but it didn't destroy the whole building. There's a lot about that in the Statsburg book. There was actually some damage done there. The Astor School is right next door, and they had an incident once where the kids came across, because obviously they weren't open in the wintertime, and the kids came across the snowy field from the Astor home, and they destroyed the restaurant, broke every plate, glass, everything. But the worst thing they did was Franklin Roosevelt, he was a big enthusiast of model ships, and he donated a model ship to the Norrie Point Inn. It sat on the fireplace mantle. The kids burned it. So there's so many stories like that, but the reason I'm telling you that one is that it's not too smart to do that in the wintertime when your footprints go right back to where you came from. And they caught the kids the next morning, because when the groundskeeper came around and saw the place was destroyed, all he had to do was look down and follow the footprints, and the police went and... Yeah. Yeah. Okay, there's another hand there.
When did Hyde Park officially get its name, Hyde Park?
It happened actually when Hyde Park was established, 1800. It happened really because of that post office across the street, which wasn't even thought of. That was built in the 1940s. But they needed a post office if they were going to have an official municipality. And so from Washington, the Postmaster General got in touch with the people here, the officials here, and said, we need a name for the post office. And that's when the Hyde Park moniker was attached to the community, because they called it the Hyde Park Post Office. Thank you for letting me work in the post office 38 years. I wouldn't have been able to answer that. Anybody else? We have one down here.
Yes.
Okay.
Tony, I'm wondering, where is Cromwell located?
If you go south on Route 9 and you make a right-hand turn going towards the river on Mansion Street, Mansion Drive, thank you, you will come right to the front gates, but they're padlocked all the time, so. How do you get in there? Well, see, that's the rub, because I called them up and said, hi, I'm Tony Musso from the Poughkeepsie Journal. I'd like to come in and take a picture of the building because I have the text, and they never returned my call. Yeah? Okay, I'm going to Cromwell.
Anyone else?
Anybody else?
Anybody else?
Here, ma'am.
I was just telling my friend here that you did a wonderful presentation for the Historical Society on the Playhouse. Can you just say a little something about the Playhouse?
Yeah, I was actually going to that was one of the slides I had to eliminate, because originally I told Sue, and by the way, I want to acknowledge, I've been here several times at the Fireside Chats. I want to acknowledge the great job that Sue DiLorenzo and her staff, all the workers. This is one of the best programs you could ever created here for the winter months. We're all inside huddling around fireplaces, and this gets us out. And it's a great program, and I think all of you in the back there do a great job. Now, what was the question? The gray is real.
Playhouse.
The Playhouse. I did a presentation on that. That is familiar where Vanderbilt Lane is. Well, it's very easy to find, because if you go through the Vanderbilt estate, you must exit from the northern gates. And if you cross Route 9, you're on Vanderbilt Lane. And that was actually the site of Frederick Vanderbilt's farm. And I have beautiful pictures of the farm back in the day with all the animals there. He built a world-class farm. You know, you could tell by his mansion, money wasn't an object, and he built a beautiful large barn and all the facilities around it. And then in later years, obviously in 1938, when Frederick Vanderbilt passed away, his niece inherited the estate, and she donated the mansion and the surrounding grounds to be a federal, a visitor's place where you can go for tours and everything else. Well, the property that he owned on the other side of Route 9, which was pretty substantial too, was sold off privately. The barn that was on the Vanderbilt farm originally was converted into the Hyde Park Playhouse. And when I was doing research for that dedicated presentation for the Historical Society, I was so fortunate to find the woman. It was a couple that founded this, that founded the Hyde Park Playhouse, and she was, Patsy, 93 at the time, or? I found her up in Ancramdale. Polly Masters, who was the daughter-in-law of Edgar Masters, the famous poet. Yeah, daughter-in-law, yeah. The husband was the son.
Hillary was her husband.
Yes, and he was a writer. He was in fact, he did, if I'm not mistaken, he started the first Hyde Park newspaper.
He did, the Record, the Hyde
The
Park
Record.
Record.
Anybody remember that? Wow. So anyway, they had the Hyde Park Playhouse in that barn, and I went up to Ancramdale to interview who could you get better information from than the woman that created this whole operation. And she told me that that tower that was originally on Frederick Vanderbilt's farm ground, they turned that into the box office. And the very first day that they opened the box office for the first season, she heard a car, that was a dirt road back then. She heard a car coming down, and she peered out of the window of the tower that's now in ruins. You could still see about half of it, I guess. And a bow-legged Eleanor Roosevelt made her way up to the box office, and she bought the first subscription for the first season. But she said she had a very unique way of blending in with the crowd. She was there all the time, but you would never know it. I guess, I don't know. She wore sunglasses. But the people didn't know she was there, but she was at a lot of shows. And then Polly actually, I surprised the Historical Society by having her daughter come in. She's a professor at Massachusetts. She came in and brought Polly to the meeting, but I didn't tell anybody. I just said, this is a friend of mine, and she's here. And when I got to the Q&A section, I said, I'm not even going to touch this. Here's the woman, and I introduced her, and it was a really nice night. So she was about 93 at that time. A couple of years older than me now.
Anyone else?
Any other questions?
No more questions? Okay. I do have all three books sitting on the side here. They're all $15, no tax. I'm not working for the government anymore. And I'd be happy to sign them. But above all, I always get a nice turnout here and again tonight. Thank you very much for coming.